Hello everyone, today we talk about the Neo-Hittite army organization. We are between essentially the 12th and the 8th century BC. We are in fact in this essentially Syro-Hittite reality. In Syria and Eastern Anatolia were such kingdoms, some city-states, other more tribal in nature, depending really on this broad region, as you can see also from the maps, dwelled essentially at the outskirts of the Assyrian Empire. The Aramaean peoples that were actually expanding, as we will see now, in the area from the south, the so-called Sea peoples, with which some of these groups really were mixed or were properly just in their confederacies against, especially in order to protect, as we'll see now from the Assyrians, they would be constituted of the Neo-Syro-Hittites, essentially being in fact a mix between the Indo-European branch of the former Hittite groups and these, especially this new Semitic settlers from the north of Arabia, the Aramaeans, that we will see separately, because today we focus just on the army organization of the various cities, city-states, realms that we can identify as specifically Neo-Hittite. These regions had, as we were saying, been part of the previous Hittite Empire, right, and had been overrun by Anatolian peoples during the Sea People disturbances, right, following the collapse of the same Hittite Empire, in fact, around the beginning of this period, well, 1200 BC, right? So that had been a big deal, as you know, in the history of warfare. We were talking yesterday just about similar times, at least in the 8th century, Rome, as far as Bronze Age warfare, chariot warfare especially, was on the decline. The Sea peoples were essentially bringing in these tougher infantries that could resist more functionally to chariotry. Cavalry was essentially developing at this point as an actual arm proper next to chariotry, as it will be evident here from the lists of the Neo-Hittite, single Neo-Hittite contingents also when levied, for example, by the Assyrians, as we will see it later. There is very fascinating evidence coming, especially from the annals of Shalmaneser III, recording the contingents making up this Neo-Hittite Aramaean, and as we will see also even more extensive force as far as the place of origins of various contingents that fought against him, Assyrian king, at the Battle of Karkar of 853 that we will describe briefly afterwards. I would like to point out this video will touch on different aspects of tactics and single battles and campaigns, but it is primarily designed to describe the army organization of these peoples that were often, just as you understand, also quite fragmented on their own. Polities at the time, even in the most prosper of empires, right, and political compaction, were quite fragmented, right. They often fought against one another. These here are specifically just the consequence of a major collapse, followed to these waves of invaders, even from relatively close, right, geographically, but also more far away. And we see, in fact, them being the weaker side compared to the Assyrian Empire. So the sense is that their armed forces were primarily organized to resist the conquests that, in part, the Assyrians also were successful in, right, and trying to cope with the internal dynamics that brought them to, again, ally themselves all together at some point, and then turning against one another just afterwards. This is completely typical. It's interesting to note, by the way, that one Neo-Hittite king, XII-VIII of Adana, known to Assyria as Ku, refers to his people as the Danun, that were actually one of the Sea peoples. Right? This comes from an inscription, and so you can understand how composite this picture really is. These were peoples coming from the European heartland, we will talk about them and their warfare specifically, but as you know, they were a bit like the party destroyers of the situation, but still injecting this sort of greater bulkiness, especially of infantry. That was their thing, even though cavalry, as we will see now, was still quite advanced and fundamentally retaining a great importance, even just as territory, etc. And now these Neo-Hittite or Syro-Hittite states used the as yet undeciphered Hittite hieroglyphic script instead of the cuneiform one used by the Hittite Empire. Right. Part of the reason why this change was that during the reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep III was a close diplomatic relationship between Egypt and Hatti, so the Hittite kingdom, and this led to essentially cultural exchanges and assimilation of certain Egyptian practices, especially at this higher level of rule, administration, etc. So writing, including the use of hieroglyphics that were somehow more more complex, also more just more expressive. There was some broader cultural depth to them compared to the Hittites. Naturally, were warlike people fundamentally. Were just refining at the contact with these other civilizations of the Near East and Egypt. Now, by the 12th century BC, the following states already existed. We can list them as different, in fact, institutional realities, right? There was Tabal, for example, a confederation of city-states in the Taurus Mountains. Kamanu, a conglomeration, the capital, at least the most powerful city, of which being Melid, that is Malatya, by the way. Kumuhu, that would be the Commagene, Karkemish, Arpad, Yadiya, that is Zinjerli, Hatina, also known as Unki. You have Luhuti, that is Aleppo, Hamath, Til-Barsip, Adana, we have seen being called by the Assyrians Kwe, and Guzana, Tell-Halaf. Right, so it's actually a pretty also compact reality scattered across actually very strategic territory, because it controls the Taurus passes, the Iron Gates, and this as you understand, was in fact the gateway to the west, to Anatolia, for the Assyrians. And this frontier, as you know, historically we've seen it in other eras, was always a bit, in fact, the one at the outskirts of the great Mesopotamian empires that tried to push west against these powers north that were somehow more, in fact, brutal, more barbarian, more tribal. Of course, there were these cities, so they were advanced places for the time, but they had retained a somehow more, first of all, in fact, mostly tribalistic, militaristic character, but also they had been invested by these waves of barbarians that were reinforcing, especially the bulk, as we've seen, of their foot troops, but not all. A dangerous combination, because you have city-states with some wealth and technical advancement and territorial control that can absorb these war bands coming from the outside, and so creating this mix in spite of their political division. And also considering the nature of the territory, etc., it was very complicated, even for greater powers to campaign there, right? Even a short range from, say, the Assyrian bases of power, this was an important bulwark, right? Especially savage peoples from the hinterland that were, especially in the mountains of the region, that were quite just warlike and incredibly difficult to tame, right? There were areas that still, until late antiquity, had not been properly civilized, right? Think about the Zaurian revolt, etc. Because, say, there were some ways, we'll see now, some routes, some, especially the coastal areas, were somehow more, of course, importantly advanced, but some islands of the hinterland remained fundamentally severed from the rest, or at least at the outskirts of the most important centers, never quite achieving that level of development. Now, in addition to this, as we were recalling in the beginning, in the 11th century, Aramaean tribesmen began to settle in southern Syria. Here they found the kingdom of Aram, centered on Damascus. And we have, in fact, these Aramaean kings, right, dynasties establishing themselves in the Neo-Hittite states of Arpad themselves, which became Bit-Agushi, Yadia, which became Samal, Til-Barsip, which became Bit-Adini, and Guzana, which became Bit-Bahiani. Now, who were the Aramaeans in this context? Well, they were essentially, again, tribal groups led by these kings, chieftains that moved from the south and exploited, say, the decline of the Hittite Empire, the nomadic lifestyle, and an important propensity for trade and economy in general, to settle in these areas and taking control, managing local resources, and fundamentally also mixing with the local peoples. Right? Consider that the fall of the Hittite Empire had been a really big deal because it was a powerful force in the region. So when it underwent this decline in the late Bronze Age, this weakened the Hittite control over certain areas, right? Creating opportunities for other groups to settle in such territories. So the Aramaeans were, as we said, Semitic-speaking peoples who were traditionally nomadic or semi-nomadic. They were, again, this peoples from Arabia that always lived at the outskirts of civilization, and every once in a while, whenever there was a crisis, they basically pushed in. I made a video some time ago about the Amorite warriors in previous times, was pretty much the same background, right? And we observed just even what their lifestyle was about, etc. Here we're talking about kind of more entrepreneurial groups, right? But still somehow primitive, given their pastoral and trading lifestyle, right? So the Aramaeans were often on the move, seeking pasture lands and new economic opportunities. So the unsettled state of Hittite territories may have presented as fertile ground for them to establish themselves there, to settle down there. And of course, there was also trade routes involved here because of the aforementioned frontier area between Anatolia and Syria. So while some trade routes may have become less secure or disrupted, right, the Aramaeans, with their reputation as skilled traders, may have seen an opportunity to capitalize on the situation by establishing in Hittite territory, taking advantage of the existing trade networks. And in fact, there is a sort of overlap. In fact, today I was tempted to deal with the Neo-Hittites and the Aramaeans altogether, but I realized that there are some differences, and that still these are important just by background. There were also the Assyrians somehow in between. Like, one of the greatest problems of these movements is that it was intrinsic to the political and territorial control of the time. Like, you couldn't quite block these groups. Sometimes they just entered en masse. They would cross the land, they would ravage the crops and all this stuff. At some point, it would settle somewhere else. So, especially in the late Bronze Age, it was difficult to maintain a control of these peoples. And in some instances, they would have just brought manpower together with them. So, as we will see now, in fact, for the Neo-Hittite cause against the Assyrians, and with Aramaeans that just settle in the same places, not with the best of intentions even towards the Neo-Hittites, but still, right, eventually joining forces against the main power, the main threat. So by the reign of Ashur-Nasir-Pal of Assyria, ruling from 883 to 859, such Syro-Hittite and Aramaean states became increasingly under pressure because of Assyrian expansionism. Sometimes several of these polities combined, as we said, to resist Assyrian conquest. However, during the times in between, such tents, right, they often still fought, of course, against each other. The Bible and Assyrian annals show us that Israel and Damascus could join forces against the Assyrians. However, when the danger passed, they were soon at war with each other again, right? So you see in this case, at least from one side, the Israelites that were in another sector, but still Damascus was part of this game, right? This is somewhat reminiscent of the Crusade era as well. Ashur-Nasirpal II conquered the states east of Euphrates, and Shalmaneser III, his son, ruling from 859, the death of his father, to his own death in 824, conquered Carchemish, Athena, Bit-Adini, and Samal, so from the other side of the valley. In spite of this major onslaught, Hamath and Damascus defied Shalmaneser's threat for the rest of his reign, backed by numerous Phoenician city-states who were, of course, interfering with this because they wanted to stay alone with the Syrians mostly in the internet, not creating problems with their naval deal, and other allies as well. Shalmaneser's main offensive was halted specifically in the major battle of Karkar in 853. The Battle of Karkar is quite fascinating. We do not have an overload of information about it from a tactical point of view, of course, but you see this coalition forces of Aram, Damascus, Hamath, Abs, Israel against Shalmaneser III. In fact, near the battle taking place near the city of Karkar in modern-day Syria. We know that the Allied army, so fighting against the Assyrians, was made up of chariots, foot soldiers, archers. We do not know the quantities, though. The Assyrian army was also well equipped with chariots, archers, and infantry. So you see here still essentially a Bronze Age kind of deployment, but we will see better from some lists later how actual cavalry was appearing next to the chariots in consistent number. We know that the Assyrians were 30,000 men, right? So this is essentially a major field army, and we can expect the troops gathered by the various allies very far away, as we will observe afterwards, as far as Ammon, right? So that's how large the range of these political issues really would draw forces from. The battle began with a fierce exchange of arrows and spears, so a sort of skirmish by the charioteers, as we can think, before trying to smash into the enemy lines, as it had been customary. There would be a sort of caracol tactics. I made some videos about Bronze Age chariot warfare, so specifically. At this point, chariots were heavier, right? But so were infantries, because that's how they had essentially toughened up one another, and the chariots were less practical, were running out of that primal functionality on the tendentially. But at this point, you see still that they did have a great importance, even though this battle was inconclusive. There doesn't seem to have, of course, battles are somehow always conclusive in a way or another, right? We don't know what happened tactically or strategically in the quantities involved, but we realize that at the end of the day, the alliance managed to hold off the Assyrian advance, right? After 2 days of fighting, both sides suffered heavy losses. It is all the more impressive considering that these were just a coalition. Of course, this was against the big guy, again, were external aids, but the fact that the Syro-Hittites managed to hold off, the major military power of the time, speaks of a dramatic military legacy and development in these polities, right? So the battle ended in a stalemate, with neither side claiming victory, Shalmaneser III would only later do so in his inscriptions, despite the fact that his army did not succeed, even in conquering the kingdoms of the alliance. Right, and the Battle of Karkar is significant, among the other things, because it's one of the earliest recorded battles in history that involved a significant number of alliances that we're also aware of, as we will read now from the list of contingents that we know in detail. And additionally, this battle helped to establish the same military power of the Assyrian Empire. Anyway, as probably in order to stop the Assyrian army, this alliance paid a very heavy toll on their side as well. So Damascus fell, for example, to Adad-Nirari, who conquered it around 805-804 BC. We talk about Adad-Nirari III ruling between 810 and 783, in alliance, by the way, with one of these guys. It was Zakir of Amath, who records that Hazael of Aram had made war against him in alliance with Bargush, Kueh, Gurgum, Samal, and Melid. Right, so internal division still was going on, especially when, let's say, one side had been resized, at least in some ambitions, etc. So these were all, again, political and strategic mechanisms that followed even the wake of the Battle of Karkar that surely did have an impact on the Syrians as well. So probably something was loosening in terms of cohesion from a major threat, in spite of still the capacity of the Syrians to conquer the center. But there were several, right? And again, this thing, regionally speaking, is also pretty large in its own regard. So it's obvious that, say, some guys in Anatolia would, just by the sake of example, abandon, for example, somebody from Damascus at that point. And following this, in fact, a succession of weak rulers in Assyria allowed the same Neo-Hittite states of Kamanu, Gurgum, Samal, Atina, Arpad, Karkemish, Kumuhu, and Kueh to be won over by Sarduris II of Urartu. I made a bit about the Urartians, by the way, so we're talking about the northeast in the Caucasus. I made one episode for our Eurasian Steppes Warfare series. This was yet another powerful feudal people, mountaineers, that also had been catalyzing a great deal of, in fact, equestrian culture, horsemanship, because they were exposed by essentially the peoples of the Cimmerians, also what would become the Scythians later. So throughout all this time, we would see, say, cavalry developing and, say, various war bands of adventurers crossing all this territory and somehow altering the balance of this and that power. The aforementioned coalition, however, was defeated in Kumu by Tiglath-Pileser III, right, Assyrian, who went on to reconquer northern Syria and commenced the annexation of the Neo-Hittite and Aramaean states of Syria as provinces, in fact, of the Assyrian Empire. Right, so you have lots of back and forth. The Assyrians are still, however, the major power already. And the final conquest was essentially complete by 700 BC. So at least the Syrian part of this policies was absorbed by the Assyrians. We have, after all, good representational evidence from these polities supported by Assyrian records, mostly, showing that hosts contained an importantly developed chariotry, cavalry, infantry spearmen. We know of regular guards and light spearmen, archers, slingers, even camelry. We will see that there was also a process of Aramaean influence, even though you could have camel troops as well just in these places. And you realize that cavalry specifically is a thing. Cavalry is kind of a new thing. This is not to say that it was novel to see somebody riding to battle on horseback. Just the concept of making an effectively and collectively trained cavalry to be used as an independent arm and not, as we will explain now, as a sort of retinue of charioteers. Literally, probably something that was scorporated as a crewman of the same chariot and placed on horseback, right? From a military point of view, it's something relatively novel, or at least it is forming, is taking shape, especially from this influence from Central Asia, the Pontic steppes. Again, we've seen it extensively, and it's pouring around these areas, right? Historically, this like the entire Middle East, the Near East, are all ravaged, explored, we can say looted, but also in this sense syncretized with a lot of what was going on in the Ukrainian steppes, to the point that, in fact, that presence of the horse archer and also the shock component eventually develops importantly in this areas. Again, I made a video about the Urartians explaining that side of the story. Sedentary civilizations were a bit more about, of course, chariots and infantry. Even when cavalry developed, this was not necessarily, well, at some point it was minority still, but at this point here we see more or less 50-50 quantitatively with a charioteers. Whereas, when you look at the Cimmerians, the Scythians, you start seeing entirely mounted forces. You could, of course, dismount occasionally, but that were another thing, right? These regions will also suffer from the raids of these guys. So we find, and by the way, I will make lots of videos. I will dedicate myself thoroughly, for example, here just for the Neo-Hittites and the Aramayans, and several videos about the archaeological iconographic evidence of what these warriors looked like, because again, through documents and other sources, we really have a substantial idea. It was, again, late Bronze Age, beginning of the Iron Age. It's incredibly primitive, materially poor and brutal reality, so it's not that troops that differ dramatically. But already at this point, you start seeing an important level of development, of segmentation, of certification. So it's a very interesting phase of change. The good chariotry, cavalry, and spearmen surely belonged to that broader Hittite warlike legacy. Right, the Hittites had been rocking on chariots. We know it pretty well. While the light troops, and especially the cavalry, can be seen stereotypically representing the Aramaean contribution. Right, naturally, places like Anatolia, Syria, aside from these Semitic migrations, were and would remain historically populated by light troops, especially infantry, good mountaineer forces, etc., ideal for ambush. I mean, even made a bit about the Tureophoroi in Hellenistic times. I mean, conceptually, even if with different names, that's what technically they were, aside from, because, as explained also in that video, a Tureophorus was a pretty generic term, could be just like these guys that literally fought with an oval shield and a javelin and a spear, right? So, it's a javelin slash spear, so you don't have to be equipped like an Hellenist, we can say, also because the Tureos was not even... it was actually, well, I explained that too, was not even just a foreign thing compared to the Greeks that were developing similar forms of shields way before they got it from the Italics and the Celts. But, right, you find this very large amounts, by the way, of this Anatolian mountaineers throughout a very long time in the military history of the region. So the idea is that the Neo-Hittites were somehow more established in their cities, in their kingdoms, and so when the Aramayans arrived, these were still kind of the outskirt people in some way, so they could be lighter, more primitive, right? And so for fighting with these lighter forces. Of course, they had their heavies as well, but less compared to the Neo-Hittites, even though they ended up mixing with one another on the longer run. Now, these, again, Syro-Hittites, Neo-Hittite states could field numerous and powerful armies, as we observed, especially in coalition, right? And probably there was a high level of bellicosity and military quality within them, exactly for this reason, right? Not much for the fact that they were fragmented, that of course was detrimental, but in the sense that they had the resources to still thinking about killing one another as opposed to thinking the bigger picture, with the Assyrians so close. So there was something to it, of course, and they still leave the vestiges of the old Hittite Empire, right? We find, especially the forces of Hamat and Damascus being very effective on their own, right? Sort of kingdom states that could act even just as individual powers. The annals of Shalmaneser III record the contingents making up the allied army that fought against them at the aforementioned Battle of Karkar in 853. There is some detail to it. As we were saying before, we don't have the total number of troops, but we have a pretty in-depth idea of what the stuff could be, considered that here actually the total is larger than what we think an army of the time could sustain, especially considering that the Assyrians already had stretched to 30,000 men, was enormous. So probably were even less, but we don't know. So that's the uncertainty, because otherwise these numbers surpass even the Assyrian ones as a total. The overall commander of the coalition was Hadaezer of Damascus. So of course the bigger powers were also the ones who were entrusted with the command. During these assemblies, these leagues were formed, right? A lot of competition among all these various actors, but surely a sort of hallmark of quality when it came to these more powerful ones, as it was recognized. Simply because they were habituated to move more men to just be able to supply them most of these major campaigns. Because consider, of course, that the larger centers were also the ones in the more, of course, devil places, and the closest also to Assyria, etc. So many implications of this. However, the annals of Shalmaneser III. Here we get the list of the contingent. So it says Damascus, 1,200 chariots, 1,200 cavalry, and 20,000 infantry. One could make the case that this is too much for the single powers, especially individuals. We're talking kingdoms, and of course there were multiple settlements within, but they're also relatively modest. We're talking about the first half of the first millennium BC. So you can, again, looking at the total, of course, think these were actually less, and substantially less. Then Hamat, 700 chariots, 700 cavalry, and 10,000 infantry. Israel, 2,000 chariots, 10,000 infantry, and actually this number of chariots seems to be confirmed by Israelite textual and archaeological evidence, which is fascinating, because of course Israel was a bigger power, and this is still a pretty big contingent, especially the one of chariots, but it's still a thing, right? We will talk about the Israelite armies at the time, because they're really fascinating. We notice here of course, immediately a cavalry from these northerners and the Israelites not having it, right? So that thing we were saying before, that of course the peoples who were more exposed to the nomadic world had at this point starting to have proper cavalry, not just chariotry. And we can be fairly sure that the Israelites had some cavalry here, but it's not counted because it was probably less functionalized in these southern places. 500 infantry, Musri, 1,000 infantry. This Musri counts probably as a minor state in the Taurus Mountains rather than the homonymous locality of Egypt. Irkatana, 10 chariots, 10,000 infantry. This is curious, right? 10 chariots and 10,000 infantry. Arpad 200 infantry, Usanata 200 infantry, Xi'an 30 chariotry, 10,000 infantry. The Arabs of Gindubu that bring 1,000 camel riders, and Ammon in Libya 1,000 or more infantry, but the figure is incomplete. Now, this gives a pretty interesting picture of the war, because you realize, especially from Quayon, where the first three powers, like Damascus, Hamath, and Israel, are the ones that really count. These others, aside from Xi'an, this 10,000 infantry and a paucity of 30 chariotry, also is something. Again, there were peoples that were, again, very poor, very primitive, somehow very unstratified socially, so they didn't have really much of an elite, so they just fought as infantry. They had this few scattered mounted forces. In any case, you realize that the most updated forces are something. This is not the total even. So we count something more than, for example, 40,000 infantry, which is a bit, maybe not to say too much, definitely, because, managing a 30,000 army, especially, this is all a coalition force, whatever, it's pretty complicated, right? This was complicated even for the Assyrians. We explained a bit of Assyrian tactics, even trying to understand how they coped with such large forces and how they were employed, because the structures of command evolved throughout history, but at this point we're still talking about relatively primitive times, and the Assyrians were the most advanced military in the world at the time. So, this means a lot. But again, this is just an account from the, say, late Bronze Age to approximate, so you can't expect an enormous precision. But the figures, like the scale, as always, is that's what I always observe about narrative sources. They're plausible, right? They say something that makes sense within the context of reality, right? It can be a bit too much, etc. There can be some exaggeration in that regard for whatever purpose the source was writing, but the proportions here especially are very important. So we have seen some allies only send in token forces, right, and only supply small numbers of chariots that were still the cutting-edge force, spearhead. These, by the way, may represent minor city-states of Phoenicia. Other states who perhaps believed Hadadzer would be defeated, did not wish to lose their entire army with him, so they sent this reduced forces. Consider the distances as well. Here we find even Ammon, saying it's a big distance, of course, a relatively contained contingent, right? And of course, as we saw before, the losses at Karkar were indeed heavy, but from both sides at the same time. So we don't know much about the political thermometer in general to make this kind of strategic considerations eventually match with the available evidence, but we can't make suggestions. The size of Attina's army is demonstrated by Shalmaneser III's record that he slew 2,900 of her veteran soldiers and took further 14,000 prisoners in one battle, right? So this is fascinating because it gives you still a dimension of how at least these forces were considered to count large amount of men. The Shalmaneser's campaign against Hazael of Damascus, in which the latter lost 16,000 infantry, 1,121 chariotry, and 470 of his cavalry at the Battle of Mount Senir. That is Mount Serban at the time in Lebanon. Today I think it's all Syria, Lebanon, and Israel's border. These numbers are fascinating because of course they can be inflated, right? But you appreciate again the scale of these forces. Normally thousands of chariots, tens of thousands of infantry, and also some amount of cavalry. And consider that Attina was seen here to have fielded proportionally more chariots than infantry compared, say, to Damascus, which could be due to different social segmentation. Perhaps Damascus, just being more populous, was more like infantry bases, sort of, say, citizenry is a big word, but I mean there were some more commoners that could be serving in arms of some way, and Athens a bit more aristocratic. That could be the case, but don't know. So when we look at the aforementioned list of the Battle of Karkar for the Damascene forces, we realize that they probably counted her whole army. Mount Senir, where the Damascenes lost so many infantry and chariots, could essentially equate to most, in fact, of the Damascene army as such, and the fact that those 470 cavalry were taken, and the fact that, as we've seen in the list, and the chariots instead were 1121, while in the list you find unequal numbers of chariots and horsemen, could make you think that perhaps cavalry had been more successful in escaping. This is an important aspect. Like chariots, yes, were smashing, yes, they were somehow agile in their own way, but of course they couldn't simply make you escape more effectively than on horseback. So this is an idea, and consider, of course, those that fought on the chariots were a bit like the most politically, military, and socially invested elements of these cultures. So the idea that on horseback you could simply flee, and so that would be a cowardly act, is something that remained deeply ingrained, especially among the sedentaries throughout all ancient warfare. Now, some idea of unit sizes can be also guessed from records of troops recruited by the Assyrians into the Khizr Sharuti. That was a permanent force of heavy infantry, spearmen specifically, but from the Neo-Hittite subjects at a point. So this is obvious. The Hittites were conquered by the Assyrians, and later could draw forces from these subject kingdoms. Sargon, for example, recruited 200 chariots and 600 cavalry from Amath, which is interesting. This happened later, bear in mind. So you see an increased cavalry in tune with the broader decline of chariots. From Carchemish, 50 chariots, 200 cavalry, and 3,000 infantry. So the ratios have changed. Infantry has increased in importance. This forces, by the way, had been formerly the guard troops of Pizeri of Carchemish. So there were some sort of like the elite forces. This often happen in terms of subjections. It's not just auxiliaries, but you pick somehow the establishment and you force it in, like, as hostages or whatever, and so you have this entire courtly structures that move their own retinues, etc. More often, also because they were just by themselves more habituated to be on the move, being permanent professional forces, as opposed to militia that wasn't that appreciated after all. It was better just to defend the land, even as subjects at the frontier. These figures suggest, just by scale groupings of 50, 100, 200, still assuming that the Assyrians wish to recruit existing units, then we don't know whether these quantities were changing for any other reason. Of course, there could be many. There could be also just an Assyrian way of documenting these numbers, that is, the typically Assyrian unit sizes that, however, were not actually reflecting the ones of these subjects. In fact, you understand that the proportions are also different, but there is also a different political connection between those who recruited them and those fielded. Now, one of the most interesting figure of the list of contingents at Karkar is that both Damascus and Hamad have the same number of cavalry in their armies as chariotry. So this has sparked some attention because people say that, is this just a coincidence? Like, was this just the moment in which these, let's say, the two arms balanced each other in the history of warfare in these places, and if so, what relation was there between them? Because evidently they were connected in one another. We don't know how, however, at least it's not explicitated. So there are various options that also can overlap with one another. So it's possible that the horseman could be a retainer of the charioteer, right? There could be a sort of maintenance one, that is to say, one chariot and one horseman could be maintained by a land grant or individual as a single unit or contribution. So a sort of administrative reason how many troops had to be fielded just for each district. It could be a logistical reason, right? That is to say, for example, this horseman could forage also for the horses of the chariots. There could be some other organizational reason that we don't understand entirely. It's likely that it was a tactical synergy, right? The horsemen at this point again originate maybe, yes, as runners, as just as looters, whatever, but they could eventually just pair the charioteer. Another option is that they could be actually one chariot crewman that separated from the chariot and essentially follow the chariot on horseback to assist them. This is the one I like the most, if anything, because there is a scaling in the size of crews among these, especially the Neo-Hittites, right? For a specific reason, right? The Assyrians, the Egyptians, even the early Hittites had used 3-man crews, right, on chariot. Some different development at the fall of the Hittite Empire had brought the Neo-Hittites to instead field chariots with 2 men. Right, we have instance of 2 men with 2 horse chariots, by the way, plus cavalry in this context. There are also heavier chariots with 4 men, but still the average is this smaller chariot. And this is interesting for a reason, because actually in the open, say, of course, big powers like the Assyrians, the Egyptians, even the early Hittites had tended, at least with the decline of chariot warfare, to increase the size of chariots, like to make them more robust, etc. Because also they engage in this major clashes, mostly in open plains, so with lots of chariots, and it was important to have the bigger stuff. The Neo-Hittites, if you look at their terrain, etc., they lived in places where chariots were, of course, practicable. Like, there's no region in the world where, in absolute terms, you can't use chariots. Yes, I mean, I can think of some, but definitely everybody can, but it can be more difficult, right? Just like yesterday we were making the case that the Romans used chariots in their archaic warfare, but nobody talks about it so much because it turns out that at least the Roman evidence is scarce for that, even though we perfectly know there were chariots there. Why? Because the Italian heartland is all hilly, and it's not that great for chariots. So you can imagine the Taurus Mountains, the Anatolian hinterland. Well, it's not perfect for chariots. Maybe the Syrian plains, yes, but in fact, we've seen also Damascus with larger forces, even though, as we've seen, not the largest proportion of chariots compared to infantry would field them. So the Neo-Hittites may have essentially updated along this thing. When we look at instead those more advanced peoples, but this is true for the Assyrians, but possibly also for Urartu, Iran, right? You see that there again, these places are more sensitive in a way to mounted warfare compared to other peoples further south, because they're closer to the nomads and their incursions, and they start developing literally cavalry as assisting the chariot, right? So that's how it basically would have worked, right? As opposed to, but since, however, chariots in those cultures, especially the ones of Mesopotamia, the open flatlands, were becoming ever more challenged by infantry, the point is that they would make chariots ever bigger and bulkier, and so also fewer and less maneuverable, and just for smashing into the enemy, not like, with those complicated maneuvers before in the heart of the Bronze Age. So there are various factors intervening, and it's not so linear as you understand. But this Neo-Hittite combination of 2-man, 2-horse chariots and cavalry was apparently, for them, a better tactical arrangement than the 3-man chariot. It was less effective, and as we've seen even at the battle in Lebanon, the Syro-Hittites probably managed to save a substantial amount, hundreds of people, because they were mounted. And they could escape, so that was a big deal. Cavalry again was forming as developing the shock force and whatever gradually, right? For now, chariot was still there, but you can see the reasons why it started developing also in that way. As far as the troop figures levied from Amath and Carchemish by Sargon, so we're several generations later than Karkar. The numbers of cavalry do not equal chariotry, right? And this could be because the Assyrians considered cavalry to be more useful than chariotry at that point, and cavalry may have now become a completely separate force, right? So we see something, again, as we were saying, this is happening later, and it highlights essentially just the course of, say, the cavalry development on the longer run that would have supplanted chariot warfare, right? However, still at this point, it's likely that the connection between chariots and horses assisting one another, and even in a sense serving one another, especially cavalry, the chariots, may still connect the figures in proportions now that are not clearly intelligible, but that surely were to them, right? So this is overall the general picture, and as you understand, it's somehow nice to play with a bit this kind of figures, because you can say it's difficult to find figures that do not make sense, right? Unless there is a bad translation or whatever. It's usually this stuff always reflects something that we know, one way or another, about these worlds and their kind of military development that, as you understand, is pretty interesting in of itself. So we will keep talking about, of course, the Neo-Hittite warfare and about all these various actors that, in fact, we know an impressive amount of, considering how relatively old this stuff really is. I mean, again, it's not that far away from, say, I don't know, the Achaemenid Empire, but it's still a very primitive world that also shows, in fact, how fast actually military development started to be historically in the ancient world from this time onwards, compared to the previous ones, especially, right? So for today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.